Hi, welcome to Al-Muqaddimah. My name is Syawish. When I started this channel, my purpose was to learn and teach Islamic history from a secular perspective. At the time, I was naive and young enough to believe that my work and my religion don't really intersect, that my personal beliefs were on the side and I was going to be talking about what I learned from books by secular historians. But unfortunately, that's proven to not really be true. I've seen that the religion of Islam and the history of the people who call themselves Muslims cannot be separated quite as neatly as I would have liked. This is especially true when it comes to the early history of Islam, particularly the 1st century. The origins of Islam and the teachings of Islam are linked intimately, at least for the almost 2 billion Muslims around the world. Now, because of all that, my faith as a Muslim and my work as a student and teacher of history come up a lot in the comments of these videos. So today, I wanted to discuss that. Before we begin, I'd like to tell everyone that my merchandise store is now up on almuqaddimah.com, where you can find really cool wall posters like the Timeline of Islamic History, which condenses 1400 plus years of Islamic history into a beautiful timeline. There are 2 versions of that chart, one with portraits of important figures and one without, so you can pick whichever one you prefer. We also have a map of the fall of Al-Andalus, which shows, century by century, how Muslim empires lost ground in Spain and Portugal until their eventual collapse on the Iberian Peninsula. So be sure to check it out. That's the best way to support Al-Muqaddimah and show off some love for Islamic history. Alternatively, if you want to support Al-Muqaddimah financially, you can join these awesome patrons over on patreon.com. The links to everything are in the description. Back to the video. Okay, I'm gonna rip the band-aid right off. I happen to come from a Salafi / Wahhabi / Ahl Hadith background. It might be weird for some to hear that, of course, particularly because a lot of my viewers think that I'm anti-Hadith. I guess that's because of my video on Islamic sources. I'll come back to that in a minute. Growing up, I was exposed to a lot of Wahhabi teachings quite early on. My father had a huge library of very Wahhabi-leaning, if not outright Wahhabi books. And I did read some of them, and my views on Islam were very much shaped by that particular idea of Islam. For those who don't know, Wahhabism refers to a sect of Sunni Islam that was founded by Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab in the 18th century. However, Wahhabis themselves, of course, trace their lineage back to the Prophet and his immediate successors. Those successors are known as the Aslaf, from which the term Salafi comes from, which is what the Wahhabis call themselves. Some people would even object to me calling the group Wahhabi, but as one, I don't really care about the name. Now, Wahhabism is a puritanical form of Islam, as Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab declared a lot of common practices found within Muslims to be un-Islamic and even anti-Islamic. Sufism, for example, is kind of a big no-no for Wahhabis due to the mystic form of religious expression. Wahhabis believe in the Quran and the 6 or 9 venerated hadith books, the most famous of which are Sahih al-Bukhari and Sahih al-Muslim. Now, I do still continue to believe in Wahhabi teachings. For a while, especially around the time that I started this channel, I had quite a bit of Sufi leanings too, but as I've studied the history of Islam, that's kind of faded, and now I'm somewhat back to puritanical Wahhabism. I do believe in other people's right to believe and express what they want, and I don't usually argue with people over religious points. My beliefs are quite personal to me, and I don't think that just because I don't think that someone is close enough to what my understanding of Islam is, they should be considered non-Muslim. I really don't go around labeling people as Muslim or non-Muslim. I do like Sufi music and poetry, but I do have quite a few disagreements with some of the staples of Sufi belief system, if you can call it that. So what made me puritanical in my understanding of Islam? Believe it or not, that was actually studying the secular history of Islam. I've come to believe that Islam is a very strictly monotheistic faith. Other than Judaism, there's probably no other faith on earth that's as monotheistic as Islam is. When we come to the revisionist school of Islamic history and look at things from that lens, we see that early Islam basically had 2 points. That there's only one God, and that the hour is upon us. The hour refers to the end of times when the world will end and the final judgment will commence. The earliest chapters of the Quran also focus on these 2 things. There's stuff like heaven and hell, but all of that is also in service of these 2 things. And because the world is doomed, Prophet Muhammad and his followers had to make a separate community that was made up of true believers in monotheism. This led to the emigration of the people that the Quran calls the mu'minun or believers. Prophet Muhammad founded a new community in the city of Medina called the Ummah, or literally the community. The migration is called the Hijrah, and the people who migrated are called the Muhajirun. Now here's the interesting bit. The term Muhajirun might have even applied to the entire Muslim community for a while. It's the term that, for example, the Greeks used for early Muslims. So it seems that living away from the people who aren't mu'minun was very important to early Islam. It's also evident in the fact that when the Arab Muslims conquered the greater Middle East after the death of the Prophet, they didn't settle in the obvious centers of power, but rather founded new garrison towns to live separately from the non-mu'minun. Another thing that the revisionists believe is that early Islam was open to pretty much all monotheists, especially the Abrahamic faiths. The Charter of Medina, which was a document that the Prophet put together when he arrived in Medina to make his relationship with other communities of Medina more clear and equal, includes Christians and Jews within the Ummah or the community. These days, the Ummah only constitutes Muslims, but it doesn't seem to be that way back then. So, to recap, according to revisionists, early Islam was a movement that was open to all monotheists, with its main focus on being monotheistic and living away from the sinners as a separate community because the end was nearly upon them. Now, in case you don't know, the revisionists are a school of Islamic studies that advocate for putting aside all assumptions and teachings from the Islamic tradition and starting over with reconstructing the history of early Islam. So they break down all the layers that have accumulated around Islam over these past 14 centuries and try to look at what it was at the very beginning. So even when the staunchest critics of Islamic tradition try to reconstruct the early history of Islam, they come to these few points, especially monotheism. Now, as a kid, I did read the Book of Monotheism, or Kitab al-Tawhid, by Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, and while I was reading revisionist texts, I kept thinking back to the Book of Monotheism. And so, to me at least, Wahhabism embodies that level of monotheism that early Islam seems to have, even according to the revisionists. Now, personally, even as a student of history, I do believe in the general revisionist version of early Islamic history. For example, this book, Muhammad and the Believers at the Origins of Islam, is something that I find myself largely convinced by. Fred Donner's work is quite good, in my opinion, and I've read this book multiple times, and I think that he's right. He doesn't try to reinvent the wheel and comes up with a version of Islamic history that's frankly not even offensive or shocking to Muslims if you strip away these outer layers of Islamic tradition. This is, in my opinion, the most probable version of what happened. He's not radically revisionist, for example, like Hagarism was. And I find myself agreeing with like 98% of what's in the book. So what about hadiths then? As a Muslim, I do believe in hadiths. When I pray according to the hadiths. People much more knowledgeable than myself about Islam's theology hold the hadiths to be truthful, and that's good enough for me. However, when it comes to secular history, we cannot really accept, according to the Western historical method, a book that's entirely accurate according to a 9th century criteria. So hadiths are taken by secular historians, but only as individual hadiths, judged on their own merits. That's a completely different thing from hadith as a theological tool. Of course, we cannot reconstruct any history of Islam without hadiths, or at least hadith adjacent literature, so hadiths do matter to secular historians. A problem that I have with hadith compilations, however, even from a religious perspective, is that they're treated like the Quran by a lot of Muslims. When I hold the Quran in my hands, it's something of a universal book these days. The body of the text is stable and you can rely on it. You don't have to look for other versions of it. However, people treat hadith books quite like that as well. If you have the Bukhari in your hands and you find something in it, people think that it's true. It's entirely true. There's no nuance about it. People don't try to understand where their version of the Bukhari came from. They don't know about his students who passed the book along to newer generations, or the different regional variations or different manuscripts of the Bukhari that exist. They just think that this book is the truth as it is, but that's simply not true. There are different manuscripts of Bukhari, for example, that disagree with one another over some things. When it comes to the larger points of the Prophet's biography, I do believe in them. If you fit the biography on maybe like 10 pages, I do think that it's quite accurate, but the details might not necessarily be accurate. There's other stuff that the revisionists propose that I'm not personally in complete agreement with, which is that the Prophet was not very important to early Islamic community in the way that he became later on. The earliest Islamic source outside of the Quran that mentions Prophet Muhammad is a series of coins issued by the Zubayrid Caliphate in the late 680s. That's more than 50 years after the Prophet's death. At that point, we start to see an explosion of the mentions of the Prophet's name. Many revisionists explain this by saying that Prophet Muhammad wasn't the central figure of Islam at the time, as he became later on. Some even say that Prophet Muhammad didn't exist and was later invented by the Umayyads in the 690s. However, that's a very small minority of scholars, and most do believe that he existed. I'm not convinced by this, and I do believe that Prophet Muhammad was the central figure of Islam from the very beginning. Now, a prominent feature of the Wahhabis is that they hate the Shias. I don't have that. I have disagreements with many Shia beliefs and practices in my own religious beliefs. I believe them to be the least monotheistic of the various Islamic groups. I even believe the Kharijites to be closer to the original Islam than the Shias. That's my personal opinion. I don't mean to offend anyone. However, in my videos, I really try not to be biased against Shias, and I think I've done a pretty good job so far. The video of mine that drew the most criticism in this regard is my video on the Agha Khans. However, if you watch that video, I said nothing about the Shias or the Ismailis and their faith. I merely said things about the Agha Khans. I might have been biased, true, but not against the Shias. Instead, against the Agha Khans, primarily because of them being billionaires. My problem is with the Agha Khans, not their followers. Also, I did not say anything in that video that I cannot back up with reputable sources. The sources are in the description of that video. If you find any discrepancy and you think that I misrepresented something, I'm more than happy to correct it. So again, I don't think that I have an anti-Shia bias in my videos, but feel free to point it out if you feel that way. I usually try to include the fact that quite a few of our historical sources were written by Sunnis who might have had anti-Shia leanings, and so the sources should be taken with a grain of salt. Now, coming back to my point about the Kharijites. Learning and teaching Islamic history has taught me that groups that are discounted completely as being outside of Islam might actually not be as outside as people today like to think that they are. For example, the Kharijites. For those who don't know, the Kharijites are a third sect of Islam, alongside the Sunnis and the Shias, who separated from the mainstream Islamic community after they disagreed with the fourth caliph, Ali, over the first civil war. They then assassinated Ali because they thought that he was impious and not on the right path. Now that's an extreme act that has thrown them outside of Islam. However, the core of their beliefs might be more Islamic than anything else. Them leaving and forming their own community is the most Islamic thing that there is, at least if you look at it through the revisionist lens. Like I mentioned, a big part of early Islam was migration away from non-believers. So the Kharijites migrating is actually not un-Islamic and is perhaps very deeply Islamic. They were extreme in their beliefs, and personally I don't agree with that, but even that extremeness can be justified if you believe in the revisionist version of Islam being a strict community. Now, the fact that the Prophet had written a charter about the rights and responsibilities of the people of the Ummah also tells us that Islam is not meant to be this kind of fluid, ethereal thing that, Sufism is. It's supposed to be a monotheistic community of believers who live by a certain written and rigid set of laws. Now, those laws don't actually have a lot of beliefs, rather it's just physical stuff, similar to the Jewish Talmud, for example. Now, that's my general understanding of Islamic history after all this time studying it. I don't only stick to it for my videos, however. I do explore other things as well. I don't, for example, believe in Stephen Shoemaker's ideas that the Prophet passed away after conquering Palestine, or that the Quran was originally compiled by Umayyad Caliph Abdul Malik and his general Al-Hajjaj ibn Yusuf. Also, I'm not trying to preach my understanding. You don't have to believe in the same things that I do, but this is just to give you an idea of what I believe happened during the first century of Islam. So that's a summary of my personal beliefs regarding Islam and what I have learned in the 7 years I've been making videos on this channel. God damn, it's been 7 years. Where did time go? Anyhow, buy my charts. See you next time. Don't forget to subscribe and press the bell icon. On the screen right now, you can see the names and tiers of the patrons. You can join them by pledging $1 or more to support the channel. Thank you for watching.